Boys, welcome back to the second video of this series. Now, off the rip, I just want to say thank you to everyone that sent kind words from the last video because I really appreciate it, and I'm glad to finally be able to share everything that I've learned. So the last video was on accumulation, and there is going to be an accumulation part 2, but there's a concept that I have to slip in the middle here, and it's going to be kind of complicated. It's called center axis. And before we get into it, please, if you find value in this video, chuck a like, subscribe, actually turn on notifications because I think there's going to be 11 or 12 more videos after this to wrap up the whole series and tie everything together. And with that being said, let's get into the shit. Okay, so center axis is the idea of having a level that is the middle point of every range. And I call it center axis because it is the pivot that slingshots the chart into directions. And I'll show you what I mean. So let's say for an example, you already have an established range that is something like this. And you're looking for a breakout moment, and you're seeing the chart is doing this kind of idea, and then eventually it breaks out. And the question is, what is actually going on with the positions in this range? Okay, so let's say there's already shorts here. There's been a massive rejection, it's formed the top of the range, and now we're consolidating. When it gets to this moment, you only have 66% of the shorts that are in profit from shorting that top range. When you get to here, you have, let's say, 33%. And when it touches again, none of the bears are in profit because it's break even until the breakout moment where they either get stop loss, liquidations, they flip to buying, whatever. This whole reason is why the chart will slingshot into a direction. So when you have this range, there are buyers that are fighting to push the chart in this direction, and you can see strength in this way. So with that in mind, let's move to the next idea. So, the second idea is how you can tell whether a chart is bullish or bearish depending on the center axis. So this one is pretty easy to understand. So let's say you spend the majority of the time on the top of the center axis. The chart is going to be biased towards breaking above because bears are just getting shot. These people are losing profit in their positions until eventually they get stopped out, and this is the moment where all of these get stopped out in a cascade, which is why you have breakouts. Now on the flip side, if you had the chart that was getting pushed down every time you're on the top of the center axis and it keeps consolidating down here, eventually this will break to the downside. So depending on what side you're holding the most, it's going to break out on that side. Yo, this is me in post. I just need to quickly put something out there. So if you have a center axis, it's not necessarily what side you're holding the most. Like if you have this, it's not necessarily going to break out the bottom side. What matters is how healthy the accumulations are. And this is a concept that I'm going to talk about in later videos, so I didn't want it to get too confusing. But just to give you a little taste, like for example, if you're on the top side, this is getting slammed down, and it's like grabbing liquidity here, it comes up again, fails, big accumulation, maybe grabs liquidity again, comes up, confirms this, comes up. It's going to break to the top side because around the center axis, these were pretty unhealthy moves, and this is like really strong accumulation around the center axis. But these kind of ideas I'll elaborate on further, but all you need to know right now is the idea of the center axis and how the two ranges interact. So let's keep going again. Let's say that this is the structure that you're working with. So if you're visualizing this, you should be able to see that there's these constant accumulations around center axis. There's this micro accumulation here, and it keeps pushing up towards the center axis. So you're not having accumulations towards the downside, you're having accumulations to push up. You can also see that there's pretty big pressure on this side that is pushing the chart in this direction. Then you have this final moment here, micro accumulation breaks up. So the center axis is always going to play this pivotal role in where a chart is going to break. So with this in mind, as soon as you have a high or a low, you can draw the center axis and you know that this is going to have a good reaction, a support, resistance, or a middle of consolidation to watch out for. So here, it could be first touch, it could consolidate around this, come up, accumulate towards the downside, come down, break down, or whatever. This line is always going to be pivotal, and you have to understand that. So the first part of center axis is understanding why it forms and why it's actually important with positions, which we've already talked about. There's also strategies that you can use to get pretty perfect entries. And I'll show you two that I personally use pretty much every day. So the first is taking it as a knife catch, which will look like this. Let's say, for example, you've had a small cap that has had some sort of consolidation, it's come up, it's done something up here, and it's come down. I know that the center axis of this range is going to be an absolute perfect entry. This is going to hit this, do something else, and we can enter here. And the reason is, all of these longs are supporting the center of this range. This is where they won. This is where they push the chart up, and this is where the majority of the positions are. So they hold it again to either hedge positions or to add to a continuation to the upside. So let me show you a few charts as examples. So let me go to a random fucking chart. Spell. Sick. Let's find a consolidation. So something that's like decently obvious. And there's one literally right here. So let's draw the range, which would be something like this. Let's draw the center axis, which would be here. Look at that entry. The accuracy of center axis is absolutely ridiculous when you have the right range and you understand what the implications are for what the positions are actually doing. So the first question is, how do you actually get the right range? Like if I'm here, how do I draw this? Like is it this? Is it this or like this? Or do I exclude this? Like how do I actually draw it? So personally for me, I'll exclude wicks and I'll take what is most historically relevant and what is touched the most. So if I'm drawing this range, for the bottom, I'll be like, okay, so clearly it's been touched here and it's kind of like, it's been critically important here. So it's the bodies of these and it's the top of this, bottom here. Something like this is probably going to be the bottom. And for the top, we're going to do the exact same thing and say, okay, well, this is important, but that's not really relevant here, so it doesn't matter too much. Let's take something like this. And I'll draw the center axis of this, which would be here. If we scroll across, perfect entry, because this is the point where in this consolidation, the buyers won. So there's so many positions in here that are protected by this. So if you had an entry here, this would be a ridiculous knife catch. And I remember I was kind of sad because this happened overnight, so I didn't catch it, but it's good entry. Let's take another example. So let's look at this range here. Now, the center axis on a smaller time frame is something like this. So say I'm excluding the wicks. I'm taking, like this is historically relevant, right? But a little bit lower than that because I'm trying to take the last accumulation from this. And the bottom side is a pretty similar idea. Like it's been historically relevant here. Kind of like it's the bottom here. There's been an accumulation here, and it's the origin for that, kind of confirming. So this is going to be the center. I'll draw my center axis right here. We can scroll across, and this is a perfect entry on smaller time frame for this trade. Now I'm going to draw a few more examples because this is probably going to be the most difficult part, like actually getting the right range. So if I'm drawing the center axis, let's say I'll take something like this. Because this is where all of the condensing is going on. Like this is where it's holding, it's accumulated to get in the range again, accumulating here, it's rejecting here, accumulation of this. So this is like the kind of condensed range. And if I draw this center axis, we should get pretty perfect entry. Now have a look at this. Let's try and tie these two concepts together. So we're looking for an accumulation, right? We have this downtrend here, which we'll actually talk about in, I think, like 2 videos from here. We have this accumulation here, and it's confirmed. Now, the center axis of this final accumulation is probably going to be pretty important because this is the moment where bulls stepped in to kind of confirm this whole move is breaking up. So if we go forward in time, this becomes an absolute perfect entry for this trade. Now, the consolidations have to be important. It can't be any consolidation. It has to be something that's structurally important or was historically relevant in the past or whatever it is. This is probably another example. I actually don't know. So if I draw something like this. So see how this chart is pretty range bound in this area. We have this accumulation here, which means that when it gets above this, the center axis is where the bulls want to push it up out of the range. So when it gets back to that moment, it's probably going to have a good reaction. Hopefully. I hope I'm not wrong. Otherwise, I have to find another example. You see how accurate these entries are? It is ridiculous. Okay, there's a few other small ideas that we need to talk about. Now, the first one is, if you have a run up that's, for example, like this, and then you have a massive failure, the center axis that you want to take is the first touch of the first range. So if it's here, I'm going to be taking the center axis of this because it's the first sign of support, and the center axis is probably going to be decent. So if I look at here, this is the final range that pushed it up. So I'm going to take the center axis of here, which will be probably this, go forward, and it should become, yeah, so this becomes first touch. You could take this entry and it becomes 7%, 9 hours. And if you're not really sure if it's the right center axis or if the PA is being a bit weird or like whatever, you can just wait. So you can tie the two concepts together and wait for the center axis, see how it reacts, wait for this accumulation moment, and you can enter right here and get this trade here. And even in this chart, you can see how the ideas combine. So see this accumulation, and it's touched here for the first time. You can take that entry. There's probably a center axis in here it becomes this entry. So let me look at one more chart and we'll just look at a center axis, how it reacts, and then we'll wrap up this episode. All right, so this is VGX and it's a very good example of how critical the center axis is. So if we go back to somewhere like here, we can already draw our range. So we can be like, okay, the range is probably going to be something like this, and we can change this in the future if it doesn't tend to be accurate. So we can draw something like this. Okay, so we know that this line is going to be critical for structure. If we get above this and we can hold above, it's probably going to break above. And we can draw that we kind of have this trend that this has to hold, and you can see that bulls are pushing up. Now maybe in this point you say, okay, there's actually a better level than this. Like maybe you see this polarized level here and you're like, okay, maybe this is actually the center axis. Like maybe the range is going to be something like this. And this outer range is actually the center axis of this. Like you see that? Like this range is the center of this, which can also be relevant. So maybe this is it. And now we can look for an accumulation around the center axis, which you can kind of see is forming here. Maybe you take an entry here. It's confirming, which is good. There's another accumulation here. And I would take this break, and this is probably going to break the whole movement. And that also gets the fractal catalysts, which is a whole nother fucking concept, which we'll talk about later, so don't worry. But the main idea I want you to understand is how relevant this center becomes. Like you see, it's the consolidation here, super hard accumulation, condensing, and it leads to the breakout moment. So, holy shit, I'm going to leave that there. I would recommend going through charts that have volume. It can't be just some random bullshit coin. Trying to find these center axis ideas, seeing how they react mid-range and as a knife catch. And in the next video, we're going to see how to get these perfect breakout moments with center axis and accumulation combined. If this video gave you value, please like, subscribe, get ready for the next videos. It's about to get really fucking dank. And laters.